Okay, so here we are in chapter 7. This is concerning the early republic. We're going to start here with where we left off last time. So Jefferson's election as president, and we'll end with the War of 1812. So covering about 12 years. So if you recall from the last chapter, we talked about how Jefferson's victory over Adams was the first of many changes in the early republic. We talked about it being the kind of this revolution, because it's a peaceful transfer of power from one political party to another. The first of many, because remember, Washington technically was not a part of any political party. So when the transfer of power from Washington to Adams came, that wasn't a transfer of power from one political party to another. So some of these changes are going to be peaceful. Some of them are going to be very violent. Many are now going to lay claim to the freedom and equality and promise of these things that were established in the Revolution. It's going to be people from all walks of life, the wealthy, middle class, poor whites, Native Americans, free and enslaved African Americans, women are all going to be pointing to the equality established in not only the Declaration of Independence, but also the Constitution, and claiming that for themselves. So we'll start by looking at free and enslaved Black Americans and the challenge to slavery. So it's important that we recognize that the push for equality for African Americans, the push for the abolition of slavery, doesn't begin, right before the Civil War. It had been going on. It's been going on since slavery started in the New World. There was opposition to it, and the push for equal rights for free Black people also didn't just begin when we think about, the civil rights movement of the 1950s. I mean, these are movements that have been going on throughout our history. So it's important that we see this as an ongoing thing. It's why we don't make a separate, or at least I personally as a professor don't make like a separate PowerPoint for these things, because it's integrated. It is integrated within our history. It's a part of our history. It's not a separate chapter. So we bring it up again and again to prove how it's been ongoing. So an example of this would be Gabriel Prosser's Rebellion, which occurred in August of 1800. And this was a rebellion led by an enslaved man by the name of Gabriel. He led 1,000 other enslaved men to try to end slavery in Virginia by attacking Richmond, which is the capital of Virginia. The authorities were tipped off by a member of the group. He told his master, and the master then told the authorities, and thus they were tipped off. As a result, the conspirators were captured, and Gabriel and 25 other of the main leaders were tried and hanged for this attempted rebellion. So what was the result of Gabriel's rebellion? Well, the Virginia government increased restrictions on not only slaves, but also free people of color as well, which is what they would have been referred to at the time. If you were Black, but also not a slave, the term used would be free person of color. So that's what that refers to there. It also proved that rebellious slaves would be punished if they tried to challenge slavery in any way. I mean, those hangings sent a pretty clear message. However, it also taught white residents several lessons. Number one, that Black Virginians were capable of preparing and carrying out a violent revolution. And this really challenged white supremacist assumptions about the inherent intellectual inferiority of Black people. The fear of slaves rebelling had always been there. But now, as slave rebellions are actually happening, they couldn't use that theory of, well, they don't have that capability anymore to try to suppress their fears. No, the capability is there, whether you want to acknowledge it or not, and so this is an actual possibility. It also showed that white efforts to suppress news of other revolts, like probably the most famous, the 1791 slave rebellion in Haiti, had failed, because these were directly influencing rebellions in throughout the United States. So we'll talk about the Haitian Revolution just briefly. It's not technically part of American history, but it definitely had an influence on American history, so we'll briefly mention it. So it was a revolution which occurred from 1791 to 1804. And it inspired free and enslaved Black Americans throughout the Caribbean, throughout South America, and throughout the United States as well. And it really terrified slaveholders. It's a very interesting revolution if you want to look more into it. It definitely has a lot of nuances to it because the revolution wasn't necessarily against white slaveholders. There were also free people of color in Haiti who were slaveholders as well, who were usually of mixed race ancestry, and many of them fled Haiti during the slave uprising and came to the city of New Orleans, adding to the very diverse mix of people living in New Orleans at the time. So it's a very interesting revolution, the first of its kind in the world, in which slaves rose up and successfully won their freedom. I mean, it was a successful revolution on their part. So again, interesting to look into if you want to research some more of that. But how it affects the United States is, again, this news is being flooded into port cities, and refugees are coming in. And the message is that free and enslaved people could not be omitted from conversations about liberty and equality, because look what they did in Haiti. And so clearly it's having a direct impact on the United States as well. At this time, we're also seeing shifting understandings of race. So remember that the Enlightenment beliefs are what a lot of people are pointing to when they are trying to join in the conversation about equality. So the Enlightenment put forth these ideas such as common humanity amongst all people, societal progress, the idea that society can somehow get better and better year after year as we go on. We can make a better world. The remaking of oneself. You can start off life one way and end up another way. You can make yourself. It's a very American ideal, right? Like you can start off life in the worst possible conditions and you can become, successful. So that's another really strong Enlightenment idea. And also the importance of environment. We talked about how the Enlightenment thinkers had this whole nature versus nurture argument, which still occurs today in psychology, and they were firmly in the nurture camp. It was all about your environment. They had not a whole lot of understanding about genes and inherited traits, and they believed that if you took somebody and put them in the ideal environment, no matter who they were and where they came from, that would have the ultimate effect on who they became as a person. And this really challenged old world thinking, because think about Great Britain was very much a class-oriented society. The aristocracy was not something you could just join. Like, you can't just become a lord by being wealthy. I mean, you could, but you'd have to gain a title, and there's like a whole other thing. And being an aristocrat was something that was passed down from generation to generation. Your father is, a lord, and so you're going to take over that. You're the eldest son. You're going to take over that title when he passes away, and so on and so forth. And so it's very much about, the family you're from, and where the family that you're born into determines who you're going to be as a person. And so the Enlightenment is completely shifting that thinking, that it doesn't matter where you're born or where you come from, you can be whoever you want to be. However, the Enlightenment was also focused on classifying and ordering the natural world, using the scientific method, studying the world around, classifying plants and animals and things like that. And so that also starts to make it creates connections between race and place. And so they start applying that classification not just to plants and animals, but also to people. And they start making classifications of people according to things like skin color, even head measurements and hair. Head measurements, that's going to continue on to be a very popular way of not only classifying different groups of people and of course classifying them in terms of a hierarchy, but also there was this whole study known as phrenology. It's a pseudoscience, meaning it's completely fake, but people believed it at the time, where they thought they could study the bumps in your head and determine, you've got a ridge here, that means you're really intelligent. And it's all nonsense, but they believed that it was a true science at the time. And so they, of course, made this connection then to race, and saying that the environments of Africa and Europe gave each quote-unquote race characteristics which accounted for differences in mankind. So again, trying to categorize people into different types of races, so much so that we still use that term race today, even though it's technically not correct. There is really only one race of humans, Homo sapiens, which we are all Homo sapiens. But I mean, going back to the Enlightenment and wanting to order people and put them into groups. Of course, there are cultural differences, but they're saying no, it's not just a cultural difference; it's an inherent difference. It's a different group of people entirely. So people really debated this back and forth. A man by the name of Samuel Stanhope Smith, in his essay on the causes of the variety of complexion and figure in the human species in 1787, they apparently had to have very descriptive titles in their essays, argued that improving social environment would tap into the innate qualities of humankind and would uplift non-white races, and that putting people of different races into proper society, and by that, of course, he meant white society, would gradually whiten men. So in his argument, well, if we treated people all the same, regardless of race, and we incorporated people into white society, that would uplift them and make them equal to white society. It's very similar to, if you remember from taking an American history class and talking about the Native American schools, where they would take Native American kids and send them to schools to literally learn to be white. And in this way, they thought they were helping. Like, they thought, oh, this is a way to uplift the Native Americans, and this is a much more humane way of treating the Native Americans as opposed to using violence. And so they honestly thought this was a good thing. And so that's what he's arguing here. Of course, it is very obviously racist, but that was his argument. Now, Jefferson disagreed with Stanhope. He felt that Native Americans could improve and become civilized, and of course by that he means become more white. But in his essay, Notes on the State of Virginia in 1784, he argued that black people were incapable of mental improvement and might even have a separate ancestry, which is a theory, part of a theory known as polygenesis, or multiple creations. So again, arguing like that there were literally separate creations of these different races, not that there was a common ancestor, which we now know to be factual, that we all came out of Africa, and slowly over time the human race slowly migrated out of Africa and populated the rest of the world. He's arguing that there were independent creations of humans in Europe and in Africa and other parts of the world. So that's what he's arguing there. Interesting on Jefferson's side, we now know factually that Jefferson did father children with a slave of his own by the name of Sally Hemings, who awkwardly was his wife's half-sister. His wife was dead by the time that he took up with Sally Hemings, but interesting that he would make this argument when he himself had children who were slaves and who were black. But this is before that occurred, so there's that. But that was his argument nonetheless. So let's talk a little bit more about Jefferson as a president. So remember that Jefferson's victory over Adams represents the first peaceful transfer of power, and hence it's referred to as the Revolution of 1800. And it's not just a transfer of power, it's a transition to a new set of political ideals. And Jefferson promised to practice Republican simplicity in a lot of different ways. In a more obvious way, he wanted to avoid formal ceremonies. So, for example, White House guests were encouraged to shake hands with the president instead of bowing as the Federalists did. So Adams would have guests coming to the White House bow to him. Jefferson didn't want that. He wanted to shake hands with them, proving that he's not any better than the guests. He's on the same level. And the simplicity was more than just simple etiquette. He wanted to put that simplicity towards the governance of the nation itself. He wanted a wise and frugal government. He very famously said that the best government is the government that governs least, meaning that the government should do very little and largely leave people to run their lives as they will. And so he shrank the size of the government. He cut the budget. He fired federal tax collectors. He eliminated the tax on whiskey that a lot of people disliked. And he reduced the Army and the Navy, all to save money and to shrink the size of the federal government. His view for America is a very interesting one, and very far removed from where we are today as a society. He wanted an agrarian or a farm-oriented republic. He wanted each person to own and farm their own lands. That's what he saw for America's future. Everybody having their own piece of land that they farmed independently. And so that's what he wanted. Those are going to be the kinds of policies he's going to pursue. He felt that farmers were the backbone of American society, and he believed they were the nation's most productive and trustworthy citizens. Again, he's a great admirer of the small, independent farmer. He himself, of course, was not a small, independent farmer. He owned several plantations, the most famous of which is Monticello. So I have a view over there on the right to the gardens of Monticello, which he, of course, himself did not farm. He had slaves to farm himself. But that was his vision for America. He strongly believed that freedom of speech was essential, and because of that, he urged Congress to repeal the Alien and Sedition Acts, and he pardoned those, gave a presidential pardon to those who had been convicted under those acts. So his views on what the role of the government should be are going to be tested pretty quickly with the Louisiana Purchase. So what led up to the Louisiana Purchase? Well, people living in the western part of the United States, and at this point, remember, we just go up to the Mississippi River. So if you look at the map over there on the right, the United States is that kind of like pinkish color, and everything in blue was Spanish territory. It's going to go back to France, but it was Spanish and French anyway. It's not our territory. We end at the Mississippi River here. So when we say Westerners, at this point, it meant people living like around here, which was the frontier at this time. And they depended on the Mississippi River to ship goods down all the way to the port of New Orleans and then out to the rest of the world, out to the East Coast, out to other countries. Because going overland, if you are a frontier farmer in what is today Illinois, growing crops, to take your crops or whatever it is you're producing and literally taking it to the East Coast to try to sell, your crops are going to go bad by the time you can even get them there. I mean, it's going to be so slow. There's no good roads. There's no highways. There's no cars. The best and fastest way is to go by water. So they depended on the Mississippi River. And remember that Pinckney's treaty with Spain had given the United States the right of deposit at New Orleans, because New Orleans was at the time a Spanish-controlled territory. So that's very important because they can transfer things onto ocean-going vessels at the port of New Orleans, and then they don't have to pay a duty. So very, very important. However, in 1802, the Spanish decided to revoke that privilege for the United States, and they also ceded all of the Louisiana territory back to France. So everything in blue then became French territory. Well, at the time, Napoleon is still in power in France, and he had now decided to shift his attention back to North America, and he wanted to restore the French Empire in North America that had been pretty much destroyed by the French and Indian War. However, that Haitian Revolution led by Toussaint Louverture had pretty much put paid to that theory. Remember that the slaves on Haiti had revolted, and because of that, he really didn't see it as worth his time to try to restore a French North America. He couldn't reconquer Haiti, and he just decided to scrap the plan. So because of that, he very abruptly decided to just abandon Haiti and sell all of the Louisiana territory to the United States for $15 million, which even back then was quite the deal. However, that puts Jefferson in a very difficult dilemma because the Constitution did not expressly grant the president, or Congress for that matter, the power to acquire a foreign territory, which is what's going on here. And remember that Jefferson was an outspoken supporter of strict constructionism. His argument with the chartering of the National Bank, if you recall back from the previous chapter, was that, well, there is nothing in the Constitution that says that Congress or the president has the power to do this, and if it's not a power given explicitly to the federal government in the Constitution, that power should fall to the states. So how then could he approve of the Louisiana Purchase? Well, Jefferson's advisors argued that the presidential powers to make treaties gave him implied power to purchase a territory. If you have the power to make a treaty with a foreign entity, then you should have the power to buy land. It's implied. It's not stated, but it's implied. Which, again, is not exactly strict constructionism, but fearing that a fickle Napoleon will change his mind, Jefferson relents, and the Senate approves of the Louisiana Purchase, and it now becomes part of the United States. This is hugely significant. It doubles the size of the United States if you look over there on the map to the right. You can see it's a huge amount of land, not the entirety of the what is today United States, but a big chunk of it. And Jefferson really was a huge supporter of this because he hoped it would help to fulfill his vision of an agrarian republic. If everybody's going to be owning their own land and the population is going to be growing, then you're going to need access to new land. It just makes sense. So this was important to that vision. He very famously sent the Lewis and Clark expedition to explore this territory, and their exploration accomplished the following goals. Number one, it strengthened U.S. claims to the Oregon Territory, which we'll talk about later on. And it aided to the knowledge about the northwest of America, and it mapped and explored the Mississippi and Columbia River, because remember, this is important because waterways are the fastest and most effective ways of any kind of travel at this time. So, thinking about this, was the Revolution of 1800 really a revolution? Well, it did mark a peaceful transfer of power. That part is true. And to what extent, however, did Jefferson redirect federal policies away from Hamiltonian principles? Well, let's look at his economic policy in particular. He did accept the national bank as an essential convenience. So that's something that, remember, he very much was against when it was being proposed. He, on the other hand, did repeal the whiskey tax and did reduce federal spending, both of which were something that Hamilton and the Federalists really wanted to see carried out. In terms of a domestic policy, so domestic policy means policy concerning the United States, like things going on within the United States. Foreign policy is, our relation to other nations. Remember that he favored strict constructionism. However, he proved to be flexible and pragmatic when he used Hamilton's doctrine of implied powers to justify the Louisiana Purchase. Now, whether or not you think that that is somewhat hypocritical, that you argue, well, Hamilton and the implied powers, that's an abuse of power, and then you use it when it's convenient to you, that's something that I'm going to be asking you to look at for your chapter question. He believed, however, that the public could govern itself, and he supported the expansion of voting rights to all male white citizens. It doesn't happen under his presidency, but it does lay the foundation for the eventual expansion of suffrage during Andrew Jackson's administration, in which it is extended to all white men. So, looking at some foreign policy here. When it was going on, Jefferson was an ardent supporter of the French Revolution. He really wanted to see us coming to the aid of France, seeing their revolution as a continuation of ours. However, when he came to power, he did continue Washington's policy of neutrality. Also, in 1807, he persuaded Congress to pass the Embargo Act. This stopped all exports to Europe, and it relied on the concept of implied powers once again, saying that the government power to regulate commerce could justify an embargo, which again is where you stop exporting to a certain country or region, because of course Europe is not a country. It is a continent made up of many different countries. However, that failed to stop the British practice of impressing Americans into the Royal Navy, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit, but that was the purpose of this, that the British were taking charge of American ships and taking all the sailors on those ships and forcing them to join the British Navy, basically capturing them and forcing them to join their army. That's what they were doing. And of course, we were very opposed to that, and we were hoping that the embargo would put a stop to it. And it didn't. All it did was inflict economic hardship on American farmers and merchants, because now they can't trade or sell a lot of their goods. Okay, so we talked about the American acquisition of the Louisiana Purchase. What effect does this have on Native Americans? Well, Americans are pushing for more and more land. So remember, back before we won the Revolution, the colonists were not allowed to settle past the Appalachian Mountains. So they weren't allowed into what is today Illinois or Ohio or Indiana. Those lands were part of the British territories, but the colonists weren't allowed to settle there. Well, now they are. And now not only are they allowed to settle there, they're allowed to go even further into this new Louisiana territory. However, boundaries were only one source of tensions between white Americans and Native Americans. There are things such as trade, criminal jurisdiction, the sale of liquor, and alliances. These also contributed to tension between the two groups. Despite fighting on both sides of the revolution, some Native American groups sided with the colonists and some sided with the British. So you would think in either case they should be included in the negotiations for the Treaty of Paris. However, they were not. There were no concessions made for Native allies. And this was very much a snub to the Native Americans, because not only did they, some of them, help win the revolution, they were also vital trading partners, scouts for areas in which there were no white settlement, and allies against hostile nations. And yet, despite doing all of these things, they were still condemned by white settlers and government officials as savages. And it was this ridicule of indigenous practices, disregard for property rights, that prompt some indigenous people to turn away from white practices. However, throughout the early republic era of our country, diplomacy was preferred to war between Native American groups and white settlers. Violence and warfare cost lives. War costs a lot of money. It disrupts trade, and it can ruin people's reputations. And so violent conflicts really only arose when diplomacy had failed. So Native American diplomacy also testifies to the complexity of American cultures. And so they're participating in these complex diplomatic talks between the United States and their various indigenous groups, and yet they're still treated as ignorant savages. And this poor treatment of Native American groups really inspired a lot of hostility and calls for alliances from leaders of distinct Native nations. The most famous of which come from this man, Tecumseh, who was a Shawnee leader. And he felt that an alliance of Native American indigenous populations would help to halt the encroachments of white settlers onto Native American lands. And he really placed a lot of emphasis on cultural and religious revitalization, stopping different Native American groups from adopting white practices, which would have been the goal of what a lot of people wanted to see. Well, the Native American groups wanted, a lot of the people who argued for a quote-unquote humane way of treating the Native Americans would be, well, incorporate them into our way of life. And so he called for a stop to that. And he called for a confederation of nations, distinct indigenous groups coming together under the banner of commonality. His confederacy drew heavily from indigenous communities of the old Northwest, so that would be places like here, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, that region. And he offered these communities a distinctly Native American identity and brought these disparate Native peoples together under the banner of common spirituality, and which would help them work to resist this oppressive force of these white settlers. However, despite what sounds like a very good opportunity for Native Americans to try to preserve their lands, many Native groups and leaders refused to join and maintain loyalties to the United States. Additionally, Tecumseh and his confederation faced a huge loss to the U.S. militia at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, which took place over the border in Indiana. And after that, his federation really flounders. The War of 1812 offers him a new opportunity. When the United States goes to war with the British, which we'll talk about in a second here, he sought out British assistance for their cause. However, Tecumseh himself died in battle in Ontario, Canada in 1813, and this was a severe blow to the Native American resistance. So even though he's gone and his confederation kind of disappears after that, he left behind a legacy of Native American unity that was not soon forgotten. And again, we'll incorporate that idea as we go on in other chapters. So that gives us a good transition point to the War of 1812. So the United States had been trying to avoid war with any nation, really, but especially Great Britain. And they were following a path of neutrality. We're a new nation, trying to get on our feet. The last thing we need is a war, which, as we just mentioned, they're very costly in a number of different ways in terms of lives, money, disruption of trade. However, the United States is very much angered by the British practice of impressing American seamen into the Royal Navy. So remember, what this means is there's a merchant ship carrying American goods to Europe to be sold to different European countries, Great Britain, France, Spain, what have you. A British vessel would pull up, take control of the ship, by force and take all of these merchant sailors and force them to join the Royal Navy. So, of course, it's outrageous. And Americans were very angry about it. And despite trying different tactics, placing an embargo, etc., seeking a peace treaty, nothing's working. So there were a group of men in Congress known as the War Hawks who really pressed for war. Like, we got to stand up for ourselves, make a show of it, tell them they can't push us around anymore. We're not their colonies anymore. Let's declare war. So by this point in time, President Madison has taken over from Jefferson, and he asks Congress to declare war on Great Britain, which they do. So we won't go into the particularities of the war. The war is very indecisive. Neither side wins the War of 1812. It's pretty much a draw. And there are losses on each side. From the American side, we failed to conquer Canada, which was a goal of this war. Additionally, the British burned Washington, D.C., which was a huge blow. It's our capital, of course. As a matter of fact, the White House started to be called the White House after the War of 1812. It was very badly damaged in the war, and so they painted it white afterwards to cover up the smoke marks. And I've been told, I haven't seen it, I've been to the White House before, but I haven't seen it, but supposedly there are parts where they left it so you can still see the scorch marks. So they say. Also, the British had a major defeat at the Battle of New Orleans, which we'll talk about in a second here, which made a hero of who will eventually become President Andrew Jackson. And the American Navy won many decisive duels with British vessels, which was a huge surprise because the British Navy was then the most powerful in the world. So what caused the War of 1812? Really the British practice of impressment, which violated American neutrality. They had no business doing that to us. It was very clearly unfair. And it insulted our national pride. We are an independent nation now, and here they are acting like we're still their colonies and they can push us around. Also led by Henry Clay, the man over there to the right, the War Hawks really pushed and pressured the declaration of war. Their purpose was they wanted to drive the British not just from the United States, but also from Canada, which of course didn't happen, and also to remove the Indian threat from the frontier. So the Battle of New Orleans is very important in that it restored American pride. It's a huge victory over the British, and also it transformed Andrew Jackson into a national hero, which is going to propel him to the White House in a couple of years. And that in and of itself is very significant, which we'll talk about when we talk about Jackson's presidency. It also led to an interruption in trade, as do all wars, but the significance here is that it led to an increase in domestic manufacturing. Because we couldn't import British manufactured goods, we had to manufacture our own goods, and this promoted industrialization within the United States, which will be significant, and we'll talk more about that in the next chapter. Not everybody supported the war. Specifically, New England merchants strongly opposed the war because they are the ones doing the most business with Great Britain, and so they don't want to see that trade disrupted. And so leading Federalists, who were mainly New England merchants tended to be Federalists, met at the Hartford Convention in Connecticut. And while they were at that meeting, they proposed many different constitutional amendments, all with the purpose of limiting the power of the federal government. But this meeting really backfired on them because it contributed to their demise. It made the members appear disloyal, holding their own separate meeting and making these proposed amendments to the Constitution. And so after this, the Federalist Party really does die out. It also intensified the spirit of nationalism. For example, the Star-Spangled Banner was written by Francis Scott Key as he watched the bombing of Fort McHenry, and it, of course, is our national anthem. And it also federalized Madison. And so Madison and the Democratic Republicans really take on a lot of Federalist policies. They support the National Bank. They support increased tariffs. These used to be Federalist ideas. And now you see the Democrat Republicans taking it over. And this is going to further contribute to the eventual dying out of the Federalist Party. So James Monroe's election at the end of the War of 1812 really marks the end for the Federalists. He's the last of the Virginia dynasty. So if you think about the first presidents in our nation's history, you have Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. Only Adams was not from the state of Virginia. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe were all Virginians. And he is the last of them. It also ushers in what's referred to as the era of good feelings. It's this era of a lot of optimism. We didn't technically win the War of 1812, but we didn't lose. We restored our national pride. We stood up to the British. Also, there are now no more political parties. And so that contributes to a spirit of nationalism and harmony. The whole no political parties is not going to last long, but for a brief period of time, there's only one. So the political limits are going to continue despite this era of good feelings along class, gender, racial, and ethnic lines. And the new industrialization in the United States is also going to lead to new inequality. Which leads to this chapter question. Does Jefferson's action as president, the Louisiana Purchase, rechartering the bank, etc., make him a hypocrite going against his theory of strict constructionism? Why or why not? And so that is the end of chapter 7.